Welcome everybody to Tuesday night workshop. Hope you had an awesome Memorial weekend and feel well rested and had plenty of time to decompress. We're going to talk tonight about kids and trauma, and it's going to circle back to lots of components we've been talking about over the last year that all have to do with our polyvagal tone and that part of our nervous system and how we can support our kiddos in processing things when they're young. And this is for also picking up on things that can happen when we're younger that we don't always necessarily process all the way through. And so we may see some of these things as adults or get triggered in an adult. So this isn't necessarily a just for kids seminar, or workshop, but it's definitely something to be aware of, because we can be catching these things very, very early and supporting our kiddos to have much healthier immune systems and complete different social engagement and experiences when their world is easier to process. So I'm Dr. Kristen Zawada. This is Monarch Family Chiropractic's workshop on kids and trauma. So we're going to get right into it. I have a ton of slides. Now, some of these you may notice are familiar if you've been on our other polyvagal workshops and the workshops we've done since last April. And they are, because our systems are the same. It's just a different way of looking at it, or what we need to tap into, and looking at patterns and where they show up. So some slides are new and some are going to be very similar. And if those of you are just joining us for this workshop but have never been to any of the ones we've done on talking about our polyvagal nerve and that tone, then I urge you to go get some of the background of that information on the 2 workshops we did, or maybe it's 3 now, from last year to this year. The one we just did, which was a great recap plus added things for you to do in your self-care, was 3 weeks ago, I believe, or a month ago. So know that they are on our YouTube channel, and you can go there and find them and watch them as many times as you want, or pick up things different each time you catch it. So there's going to be some things that I go past because we've discussed them, and you guys can always go back to those workshops to review some finer details. But you know, trauma for anyone, and especially a kid, compromises the ability to engage, right, with others by replacing patterns of connection with those of protection. So it's really about how a threat shifts our nervous system into a state of defense, and that interferes with the neurophysiological state that we need for optimal health, right? So there's a component of, we are designed to connect, we are designed to have those co-relationships and those very cohesive things that allow our nervous system to develop and feel safe versus feel threatened. And so we think about just what has happened with the mandates that we had over the last few years, and it is changing our biological imperative to connect, because we were so isolated for a couple years. Kids born in that era, if they weren't around other people outside their household, just haven't had the socialization that most people do at that young age. So it's important that all of us start reconnecting and changing those patterns. So this is something we're going to talk about with the developing brain, but we covered that a lot more in the other workshops. So I'm just going to touch on, let me move this up so you guys can see more of the slide. Stress and trauma and developing brain. So we talked a lot about this the last workshop, in the process our brain goes through, but even just looking at a kid, when we're looking at our prefrontal cortex, right? So there's an executive state, then there's that emotional state, and then the survival state. Okay. And the body's got to have that prefrontal cortex in a particular state to really executively learn, and how and what can I learn is what that part is supposed to do. The limbic system, when not in a good, cohesive is not the word I want, my brain's dropping it. We'll get to it in a second. But if you don't co-regulate, you're going to basically not be able to have that emotional connection. And that comes down to that feeling of, do I feel loved? Do I feel safe? Do I feel in a place where I have a support system? Brainstem is pure survival, and that is the am I safe? So we have to have those connection points in a safe environment for that limbic system to develop. And then again, to go into that, you know, what can I learn? So in a kiddo, it's really easy to see when there's different patterns of development or learning or social behavior, or even just interaction with those they live with, because those things have not developed in the right order, or have skipped orders or have had some traumatic experience to where those haven't been able to develop. And the kiddo doesn't necessarily feel either safe or have that co-regulation in order to self-regulate situations that happen. So embodied practices, I jump forward and then we'll jump back, is this bottom-up theory as far as the process or the techniques to work through the body to change the brain, and then especially that lower subcortical area, and then the brain outside of that conscious awareness and control. So there's ways in which we practice those tools for healing, and especially in a kiddo, when touch and different ways we can help them regulate and connect is so important. So we're going to talk a little bit about this impact on that approach. So I'll read some of this to you, because again, if you didn't catch some of the other presentations, some of this may be going very fast, but activation or less activation in a sense of that fear center, so that amygdala of the brain, it reduces how strongly you react to a trauma or trauma triggers, and then increases that relaxation response and decreases the hypervigilance of the feeling of always being on guard. So it's very important that that part of the brain is using that bottom-up approach, creates less activation. It doesn't create that need to always feel on guard or in that protective, I need to be in protection or defense mode. A more regulated activation then of the interoception, so that insula of the brain, which lessens how strong you react to those triggers, right? As well as just reduces anger or the emotional outburst or response to the trigger. Also more activation of the memory center, right? So the hippocampus of the brain, which is increasing that feeling of safety, which then of course would reduce the fear, has that ability then to more cope with something negative or cope through and process through of the traumatic experience. Even again, things that have occurred and most often in the past. Sorry, as I hit other buttons now, my mouse isn't working. There we go. So we talked about this last time, so I'm going to touch on it before we go into a few of these components. But the function of our behavior, or our function to behavior really, so our ANS is our autonomic nervous system, right? So there's a hierarchy, and that neuroception and co-regulation have to happen. So when we talk about our polyvagal nerve and this polyvagal theory, it's all about regulating that nervous system to and its function to behavior. So it's giving us that path, if you will, or the framework to consider when people act the way they do, or when there's something that triggers them that seems either out of sort, out of character, for others. So when we talk about how this relates to kids, it's seeing dysregulation or a kid not being able to process. This is what the nervous system looks like to them. This is not, they don't necessarily can't necessarily tell us, but they show us in ways of either the way they outburst or the other direction of that, right? Either being aggressive versus withdrawn and shut down. And those are all different parts of where they're at in that ability to either regulate or not. And so we'll talk about that again in the next slide. So when we get to, when we're talking about regulation, it's really, before we learn, right, to self-regulate, we've got to co-regulate. So the ability to regulate the emotions requires that neurosequential development in childhood. And it's determined by the exposure to a consistent co-regulator. So this is whoever that person is that you connect with or that helps you feel safe, and creates that part of our brain to be able to then process other components that come at us, right? So it drives that state or tone of our autonomic nervous system. If we don't experience that co-regulation, then it is really challenging to self-regulate and for the body and brain to figure out how to go through those steps and process things ourselves. So again, whoever that person is, it could be a parent, but it may be somebody else. It is that person that helps you consistently have a calm, regulated system. You've got to be able to have that safe relationship. So we talked about this in a different way last time. We showed this last time, but so I'm going to just show the ladder of the 5 autonomic nervous system states. So in the other pictures, there was the 3. It was kind of like, or you saw the picture we did with the red light, yellow light, green light. There is 2 other components to that make up these 5 integrated states of neuroception. So, and getting there. So the ultimate is that you're in a safe state and that your body's tapping into that vagal part of the vagus nerve. And so that really social engagement system of being able to interact, being able to process, being able to have that emotion and work through it. There's the state where we just thought it was like kind of that red, green, red, yellow, green, where we didn't really consider those 2 in between states, which are those 2 other green boxes as you taper down the triangle, if you will. But if you're in a unsafe situation or state, and the brain is always the emotion's gonna override what the brain thinks it knows, or what it knows is that, is there a danger? Is there a fight or flight risk? Is there a threat in front of me? So you're working off of what that sympathetic part of the nervous system is, right? The fight or flight, handle the situation. Well, we have to have that turned on. It's not like we want to turn it off with a kiddo. They need to be able to process that and understand danger and understand something's a threat, but be able to work through that and get on the other side of that, of their brain being able to go through those stages of process and get to a safe place. If they can, then that takes them into that green place. And we'll go through a couple slides of how kiddos do that, or a good way to show them stages of things, or how they figure out how they're looking at something to figure out where they are on this ladder. But this is no different for an adult. If somebody's in that constant fight or flight, stressful state, stressful mode, it's like their brain is always experiencing or waiting for the next threat. So there is a point where that sympathetic system is also a very healthy place to be, which is that green box across from the yellow box, where this is also this hybrid blend of the state where you're activating your sympathetic. You're not in a calm, zen, meditative sleeping state. You're playing, you're working, you're dancing, you're experiencing, pleasure with your partner, things that require us to move and excite our system, but it's also in a very safe place. So then you're accessing the vagal and that ventral vagal, as well as the sympathetic at the same time. So there's hybrid states of where sympathetic isn't bad. That is not a place we don't want to be. It's a place we want to be and able to access, but access it safely. As well as down into the red, this is when the system can't go there, and it feels the kiddo, it feels like it's a threat, or they shut down, or they disassociate, and they can't process. They don't know how to process, or they can't even get to a place of knowing what to do. This is the stage they kind of call that freeze or shut down, where they just do not have a reaction or a response almost, or they really seclude themselves into showing almost any emotion of a threat or of something that is uncomfortable. They literally just disassociate from it. Now you can be in that dorsal vagal, but it be in a safe place when you're in that ventral and dorsal, so that other hybrid state at the bottom green, which is when you are truly sleeping or relaxing or meditating, or in just a state of bliss where your system can be in a very calm state and sort of in that shutdown. This is maybe a state that a monk may go into, or somebody who has that very deep way of going into that level of meditation, and being able to access both. So this is the sign, this is the one we used last time, that you're going through kind of the neuroception, perception or discernment. You're trying to figure out where the kiddo, in this instance, as we're talking about more kids, is in this place. So are you in that safe place, that ventral vagal? Are they experiencing a threat and in that sympathetic mode of fight or flight? And really, that's the 2 we want to be functioning in. If they're in that place of feeling threat or mortal danger, it's usually that frozen state. And an adult can be here too, where they can't process through that and get into the red and then green. And that's that dorsal vagal. So neuroception, really, it's distinguishing whether situations or people, right, are safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. So our brain uses that internal, external cues in assessing where we are. And that's the response that we get based on that. That next step is having that co-regulation we spoke of. So you first have to see, okay, well, where are we at? What state does that situation or that thing or that response or that emotion put us in? co-regulating is showing, right? So that showing that development of your ability for emotional regulation has to come through connections. Somebody that's reliable, whoever that person is in your life, to support that feeling safe and understanding how to process through. So co-regulation, we talked about this, is a biological imperative need that must be met to sustain life. So having that early on, ridiculously important. But even as an adult, that's a huge component of adults getting stuck in components of trauma or things that have happened in their life now that trigger an older response, and being able to have that safe place so that they can regulate. There is a ton of research. Last time, I think we touched on a few that had more to do with chiropractic and how it taps into the polyvagal system and how we are supporting that vagal tone with your adjustment and some of the self-care we give you to do. This is research more on children with autism and this underconnectivity that happens with voice or auditory and that cortex. So I'll read you just bits and pieces of this, but children's brain showing a stronger connection between auditory cortex and the subcortical reward centers. So those couple pieces we just talked about in the brain earlier, when hearing their mother's voice, also had the strongest social communication ability. So there's a lot of connection with when people can connect and verbally connect and have that auditory piece and don't. So we're seeing that difference and that deficit with children with autism. There's also a lot of other research, but this one's talking about children with that and presenting the characteristics of that low vagal activity. So kids that are experiencing things on the spectrum most of the time have a lot of these characteristics. So we're going to go into some slides because I think it's really important that you just know what to look for as kiddos in your own household, in your own family, in your circle, in your community, because then it helps us say, okay, bring them in. We're skilled, we're trained at how to assess what stage then they're in by going through some processes in the office and then figuring out how to best support, because you don't do the same thing for a kiddo that is in that red circle versus one that's in the yellow versus one that's in the green. So you have to go through the process very differently. So in just being able to detect it and recognize it is a huge piece of why we do the workshops, is for you to understand what to look for. So seeing things like flat facial expression, right? Intonation, difficulties with vocalizing and social auditory information, the low baseline for cardiac parasympathetic activity. So that's that calming state of the nervous system. So low vagal tone and expression is something that we want to improve and increase that vagal activity and those activities in the brain in an autistic kid or somebody on the spectrum that is balancing, they're challenged with that balance. So ventral vagal, this is where we want to see kiddos, right? This is where we want to see all of us, that feed, forage, and friends. So these are different ways and just bullet points for you to look at, whether it is facial expressions, the voice tone they use, the movement they have, the way in which their body tone is, their ability to do touch, and even just not face expressions, but eye contact. It's really important and very distinguishable to view a kiddo being able to make eye contact and be able to look directly at someone versus a kiddo or an adult even that doesn't. Changing in tone, really having the ability to be in a calmer response with voice and breath, and even just the like closing eyes when touched, things that all show safety and show that they are relaxed and in a place of, I guess, safety or calm versus I'm not sure what's around the corner, right? That kind of fight or flight response, or rather no response. So when looking at a kiddo that's in that middle yellow stage, this is what the sympathetic state is of the nervous system, right? So we're going to see different responses, things that are a little bit more, I mean, I guess it's almost the overall word I would use is kind of angry, right? It can be that hostile, grumpy, loud, a lot of yelling, screaming versus just a different tone when they're upset. It can be the reverse. It could be the opposite of that in the sense of an older kid that's maybe more sarcastic or a kiddo that doesn't have control with their, like that laughs at inappropriate times. They're in this state usually. Those are big things that stand out that I just think of that we see or that parents tell us. More impulsive in their activity and their movements. Even just difference with eye contact and the way in which they move their eyes. Arched body and tense posture is something we see all the time. And we see it a lot with brand new babies when they've had a challenged delivery or just a challenged birth process, or some of that in utero. A kiddo that just doesn't sit still has to be in constant motion. They may do some acting out type things outside the normal. But again, it's kind of more of a state of the fight or flight, right? Ready to fight, ready to almost attack, and is more of a protester than someone who, a kiddo that will talk it out, or you can have a conversation back and forth about what the anger is about. And I guess I would say that's the biggest piece is a sympathetic. The third, which is that red circle, is when you see a kiddo that's in this more of a shutdown state. More passive, but just very blank, very just, in a sense, looks like a shell of a kiddo, right? Not really emotion, full of emotion, very emotionless. Voice is very flat. They don't necessarily, it might be a baby that doesn't, or a kiddo that doesn't make much noise or doesn't talk much. Definitely doesn't make a lot of contact, looks away a lot, looks down a lot. Their movements are a lot slower. Their tone in their body is very slouched because their muscle development is usually, their muscle tone is very low. Doesn't really have that need or even desire, let alone a need to feel exploratory or, curious. Kind of more of that frozen state, very non-responsive in a lot of ways in their behavior. Yeah, and I would say what I see a lot in kiddos that are in this state, the bullet there that talks about looks more at things more than people. So they focus on items and won't focus on another person. So again, hopefully those give you just ways in which to look at things. Interpreting sensation, this is the page that all of us adults are probably used to hearing, looking at, being asked. When it might be, describe the sensations related to your emotional, your physical pain, right? We have this scale of 1 to 10, or this green, yellow, orange, red, associating it with clues, but maybe more words that we can use, right? That describe how we feel. So sympathetic, it could be more of like that pain driven. Something's hyperactive, so we may feel more of that stabby, burny, shooty, right? Somebody in that dorsal vagal language, it is very disassociating. Sometimes they can't tell you how they feel. They can't give you a number. They can't relate if it's even more left or right side of their body. Kind of in a sense numbed out. And they just can't give you accurate body information. They just search for giving you an answer. So able to accurately communicate that is they're in that ventral vagal and they know exactly what they feel like their pain is doing and can describe it very detailed. So with a kiddo, this is a great example we were given in our last seminar and training on this that Doc and I did, that is by the Sarah Joseph, and she uses this Derek the guard dog and uses to kind of help understand where a kiddo is and explaining how you can calm Derek the guard dog. So I'm gonna grab my glasses. So Derek the guard dog is like our amygdala, right? Barks to warn us that it's about danger and makes us act fast. And the wise old owl is our prefrontal cortex, right? So it's helping us relate what they relate to, helps us solve problems and make plans, flies away when Derek barks. And the elephant is more about our hippocampus, right? So it's that helps us learn and remember things. So the elephant, right, never forgets. So, but unless she's scared away by Derek's barking. So kind of relating to what part of the brain does what and how a kiddo might relate to one of these types of responses or characters. So Anthony the ape is like our fight or flight, right? Or freeze or run response. So say when the elephant and the wise old owl leave, Anthony's in charge and things don't go so well. So it's looking at different ways to explain or to ask questions of and to assess where a kiddo's at and still relate to what they may see or hear and correlate that to where they're at or where they're stuck or what they can, again, relate the most to. So she has a kid, maybe I can't remember. I think it's called Brain Kids is the name of the book that she wrote. Animals in My Brain analogy. So anyway, it might be something that if you work with kiddos or that's something you've never looked at, that you have interest in. But again, that somatic bottom up response is, decreasing the activity of the amygdala, right? So reduces that always feeling on guard. Going back to increasing the activity or the interoception center is decreasing the reaction to the triggers. And that hippocampus is that feeling of safety. So again, relating some of those characters to where they're at in their development, and that our nervous system develops from the bottom up. So your dorsal vagal is the oldest. That is the most primitive. So we need to get through those processes of development in the brain, or we can't get to things of auditory and verbal response and processing in our brain. So when we're threatened, we go in that reverse order, if you will. Let's see if there's any other points I wanted to go to before we flip slides. So yeah, again, kind of tapping in on the timeline, because I don't think I put that in the slideshow. Thought it was really great just to have a visual to this. And I did, again, not having that slide in there, I'll pause here to talk about your dorsal ventral, its development of that part of the nervous system happens between 4 weeks and about 12 to 14 weeks. So really early on. The sympathetic part of the nervous system is developing more from that 14-week period to about 30 weeks. And then the ventral is happening at 26 weeks all the way up to about 12 months. So they say developed by about that into that third trimester and first year of life. So there's a lot that's happening early on. So thinking about a premature kiddo, so premature 30 weeks or younger, your sympathetic nervous system's underdeveloped, right? It hasn't had the time to do what it needs to do. And you start that dorsal and it can't really get into that sympathetic. If it can't, you'll see kids that just don't thrive. And some of them that don't make it because their nervous systems are literally not fully developed yet. And if they can't, they see sometimes these really preemie babies stay in such a dorsal tone, like the cardiac rate drops so low that they're even ventilators and all of that, they can't be taken off of it, that they don't live through not having that neural development. So it's really key that that stuff is important, that we allow to process, and that if any of that doesn't process well, that we get them support as early as possible. There is no time for waiting there. So I'm going to end on the ways in which we measure, or just showing you, let me move this out of the way again, that we're objectively measuring patients. So there are OATs, or what stands for the outcome and assessment tools. There are many things that we can do to assess the kiddos at different stages. One thing that you all are already familiar with, and I just used this slide because we already had it, but that QR code does nothing. It is just showing how the technology we already have. So using heart rate variability and a pulse ox monitor is all, pulse oximeter, all ways in which we assess not just adults, but kiddos too. So knowing that we have the tools to do that, and that really, you know, we want to improve our world, we've got to start by making people feel safe. And so our outreach is, who do you know? What kiddo do you know that, or adult for that matter, that is challenged in processing, is challenged with day-to-day things, is challenged with things at home, is challenged with things with development at school, or maybe social development with their friends. And how can we support them by not only checking for subluxation, but by adjusting their nervous system that changes that polyvagal tone and supports them to have a better ability to process and process their world and process then the environment in which they live in. So we are challenging you to let us know of someone that you know, and let them know that we want to check all those kiddos. And again, just to assess where they're at and know that they're in a good, healthy state, and support parents with the things that can feel really challenging that don't have to be as challenging if we can dial in on what's creating that. So thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate your time. And if there is things that are questions to this, that of just things I flew through that don't make a lot of sense, I would urge you to go back and watch one of the last 2 polyvagal workshops that we did last month. And then at the end of or beginning of this year, and those are on our YouTube channel, and then come in with questions and let's discuss. So excited to hear your takeaways when you come into the office. Thanks for all of you that joined us late. Hopefully you got most of that, and this will be posted on YouTube by the end of this week, so you'll be able to go back and look at slides and come in with questions. So thank you for joining us.